Force explain. It is the most fundamental experience of all, defining our waking moments and giving rise to all that we think and feel. Without consciousness, we have no way of proving we or anything else exists. And yet, what it is and why we have it remain a mystery that some of the greatest minds have been unable to solve.
The only way I know I exist is because I'm conscious. I wake up in the dark of a hotel room, I'm discombobulated because I'm jet lagged, I have no idea where I am, or even who I am, or in what country I am, yet I know I exist because I see something.
Rapid advances in our understanding of how the brain works might one day allow us to pinpoint the parts of the brain that generate consciousness. But will something as objective as science be able to explain what it feels like to be us?
Consciousness by its nature is private. It's subjective. I know about my consciousness from the first person point of view. Other people can only know about my consciousness very indirectly.
Philosophers have been trying to answer some of these questions for millennia. In the past couple of centuries, scientists have joined them. Debate can be fierce. In fact, some scholars reckon the puzzle of consciousness is something the human mind is incapable of solving.
I think that's not just wrong, I think it's culpably wrong. It isn't impossible at all. It's just that we have to buckle down and do it.
One thing that both disciplines can agree on is that consciousness arises in the brain. Made up of roughly 85 billion neurons and other supporting cells about which we know little, the brain consumes almost 20% of our energy, despite comprising just 2% of our mass.
Every so often I get kind of interested in astronomy and cosmology because you look out there and you think, oh gosh, this is amazing, you know, it's almost limitless. But then I turn around and I kind of introspectively think about the brain, and it's kind of like a universe within. We're a long ways of understanding how it works, but if we could get down to figuring out how a neuron works, by God, then we could do it at 2 neurons, and then 4 neurons, and then 4 million neurons, and then 100 million.
Helped by developments in imaging, partly pioneered by Dr. Reichel and his team, scientists can study in some detail the 2 enormous folded sheets of outer brain called the cerebral cortex. This plays a crucial role in higher brain functions like memory, perception, thought, and language.
And I have 2 of them in my left and right. And it's part of this sheet that gives rise to consciousness. This sheet also gives rise to intelligence and reasoning and all the other things that we hold dear about the human brain and the human mind.
Christoph Koch wants to come up with a satisfactory scientific theory of consciousness before he dies.
Science wants to explain everything. If science fails to explain the central fact of my existence, I would say then it's a failure.
In order to gain a better understanding of how parts of the brain work, scientists often look at bits of it that are broken.
There is a little part of the brain called the cerebellum, which is at the back of my brain. If I lose it, I will be unable to, let's say, to dance or be a rock climber, and I have difficulty moving. My speech becomes slurred, but my consciousness will not be impaired.
On the flip side, it seems that some parts of the brain may be essential for consciousness. Identifying these so-called neural correlates of consciousness would help pin down what is happening.
What might the NCC, the neural correlate of consciousness, be like? Assuming that it's an emergent neuroscientific process. And let me say straight away that we don't know what it's like.
Before his death in 2004, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, worked with Dr. Koch on something they termed the binding problem. Put simply, the binding problem asks how the brain integrates different bits of information it gets, both sensory and internal, into our conscious experience.
In real life, the brain is terribly good and puts everything together, the movement, the shape, and the color. The usual way of saying the binding problem is if you have a red square and a green triangle. How is it that you don't see it as get the colors mixed up with the shapes? That's basically the problem.
That's very
Because
great.
our experience of consciousness is derived from the data we get from lots of different systems, the visual and motor being just 2, the 2 men looked at a part of the brain that is connected to all these regions. They were especially interested in the claustrum, a thin sheet of nerve cells that sits at the bottom of the cerebral cortex in each hemisphere of the brain. Because testing the claustrum in a live human brain is invasive and risky, no formal experiments have been done. But one happened accidentally last year when a neurologist trying to understand the source of his patient's epilepsy implanted electrodes near her claustra. When he switched the current on, she lost consciousness. As soon as he switched it off, she regained it.
But wait,
It is the most fundamental experience of all, defining our waking moments and giving rise to all that we think and feel. Without consciousness, we have no way of proving we or anything else exists. And yet, what it is and why we have it remain a mystery that some of the greatest minds have been unable to solve.
The only way I know I exist is because I'm conscious. I wake up.
backstage voting. Hide and seek. Wow, okay. Lista activo, okay. That's interesting.
Okay. Seekers! Catch the hider before they reach the destination!
Oops. Está muy amplio el mapa, ¿no? Para este tipo de juego. Sé que solo era en Guanajuato, by the way. Ahora... Ah, ya lo vi, creo. Ese es el amarillo, ¿no? No sabía. Ujú. Y luego, ¿cómo lo uso? Y ya lo usé. Bueno, ni modo. Arriba. Ah, pero no tengo ni el mapa, de veras. A ver. Ah, me apareció. 50%.
Defeat imminent. Find the hider and fill that detection bar.
¿Con cuál?
Congratulations, Team Hyde. Seekers, how about a rematch?
No, no quiero. No me gusta mucho.
Made a mystery that some of the greatest minds have been unable to solve.
The only way I know I exist is because I'm conscious. I wake up in the dark of a hotel room, I'm discombobulated because I'm jet lagged, I have no idea where I am, even who I am, or in what country I am, yet I know I exist because I see something.
Rapid advances in our understanding of how the brain works might one day allow us to pinpoint the parts of the brain that generate consciousness. But will something as objective as science be able to explain what it feels like to be us?
Consciousness by its nature is private. It's subjective. I know about my consciousness from the first person point of view. Other people can only know about my consciousness very indirectly.
Philosophers have been trying to answer some of these questions for millennia. In the past couple of centuries, scientists have joined them. Debate can be fierce. In fact, some scholars reckon the puzzle of consciousness is something the human mind is incapable of solving.
Wow.
I think that's not just wrong, I think it's culpably wrong. It isn't impossible at all. It's just that we have to buckle down and do it.
One thing that both disciplines can agree on is that consciousness arises in the brain. Made up of roughly 85 billion neurons and other supporting cells about which we know little, the brain consumes almost 20% of our energy, despite comprising just 2% of our mass.
Every so often I get kind of interested in astronomy and cosmology because you look out there and you think, oh gosh, this is amazing, you know, it's almost limitless. But then I turn around and I kind of introspectively think about the brain, and it's kind of like a universe within. We're a long ways of understanding how it works, but if we could get down to figuring out how a neuron works, by God, then we could do it at 2 neurons, and then 4 neurons, and then 4 million neurons, and then 100 million.
Helped by developments in imaging, partly pioneered by Dr. Reichel and his team, scientists can study in some detail the 2 enormous folded sheets of outer brain called the cerebral cortex. This plays a crucial role in higher brain functions like memory, perception, thought, and language.
And I have 2 of them in my left and right. And it's part of this sheet that gives rise to consciousness. This sheet also gives rise to intelligence and reasoning and all the other things that we hold dear about the human brain and the human mind.
Christoph Koch wants to come up with a satisfactory scientific theory of consciousness before he dies.
Science wants to explain everything. If science fails to explain the central fact of my existence, I would say then it's a failure.
In order to gain a better understanding of how parts of the brain work, scientists often look at bits of it that are broken.
There is a little part of the brain called the cerebellum, which is at the back of my brain. If I lose it, I will be unable to, let's say, to dance or be a rock climber, and I have difficulty moving. My speech becomes slurred, but my consciousness will not be impaired.
Plays a crucial role in higher brain functions like memory, made up of roughly 85 billion neurons.
85 billion neurons. Let's actually work through that. Firebird, hush.
And other supporting cells about which we know little, the brain consumes almost 20% of our energy.
Well, that kind of makes sense, right?
Despite comprising just 2% of our mass.
2%.
Every so often I get kind of interested in astronomy and cosmology, because you look out there and you think, oh gosh, this is amazing, you know, it's almost limitless. But then I turn around and I kind of introspectively think about the brain, and it's kind of like a universe within. We're a long ways of understanding how it works, but if we could get down to figuring out how a neuron works, by God, then we could do it at 2 neurons, and then 4 neurons, and then 4 million neurons, and then 100 million.
Helped by developments in imaging, partly pioneered by Dr. Reichel and his team, scientists can study in some detail the 2 enormous folded sheets of outer brain called the cerebral cortex. This plays a crucial role in higher brain functions like memory, perception, thought, and language.
And I have 2 of them in my left and right. And it's part of this sheet that gives rise to consciousness. This sheet also gives rise to intelligence and reasoning and all the other things that we hold dear about the human brain and the human mind.
Christoph Koch wants to come up with a satisfactory scientific theory of consciousness before he dies.
Science wants to explain everything. If science fails to explain the central fact of my existence, I would say then it's a failure.
In order to gain a better understanding of how parts of the brain work, scientists often look at bits of it that are broken.
There is a little part of the brain called the cerebellum, which is at the back of my brain. If I lose it, I will be unable to, let's say, to dance or be a rock climber, and I have difficulty moving. My speech becomes slurred, but my consciousness will not be impaired.
On the flip side, it seems that some parts of the brain may be essential for consciousness. Identifying these so-called neural correlates of consciousness would help pin down what is happening.
What might the NCC, the neural correlate of consciousness, be like? Assuming that it's an emergent neuroscientific process.
Oops. El nombre lo valieron, no sé. A ver. See, complete round 3 of a Horizon Arcade in any Dodge Challenger. Puede ser este, ¿eh? Wait, sí, es Challenger. Right?
process. And let me say straight away that we don't know what it's like.
Before his death in 2004, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, worked with Dr. Koch on something they termed the binding problem. Put simply, the binding problem asks how the brain integrates different bits of information it gets, both sensory and internal, into our conscious experience.
In real life, the brain is terribly good and puts everything together, the movement, the shape, and the color. The usual way of saying the binding problem is if you have a red square and a green triangle. How is it that you don't see it as get the colors mixed up with the shapes? That's basically the problem.
Because our experience of consciousness is derived from the data we get from lots of different systems, the visual and motor being just two, the two men looked at a part of the brain that is connected to all these regions. They were especially interested in the claustrum, a thin sheet of nerve cells that sits at the bottom of the cerebral cortex in each hemisphere of the brain. Because testing the claustrum in a live human brain is invasive and risky, no formal experiments have been done. But one happened accidentally last year when a neurologist trying to understand the source of his patient's epilepsy implanted electrodes near her claustrum. When he switched the current on, she lost consciousness. As soon as he switched it off, she regained it.
No one knows why we have consciousness. It's one of the big mysteries. Why did evolution bother putting consciousness in? How did evolution put consciousness in? Why couldn't we have done everything that we do with a set of objective mechanisms and no first-person subjective experience of the world? It's one of the biggest questions in philosophy and science.
Just as the processes of consciousness remain a mystery, so does its purpose. Is it a high-level summary the brain generates to help us plan for what comes next? A clever way of designing our brains to make us more adept at being social? Neither? Both? One evolutionary explanation for why we have consciousness suggests that an animal capable of modeling the behavior of another can anticipate it to its advantage.
The surprising thing is that so few animals actually have this ability, and we humans have it. So I have a very good idea of what you're going to do, and when you're going to do it, and why you're going to do it. And children starting at maybe around 3 years old get that.
Janet Metcalf studies something called the theory of mind.
Theory of mind is actually a misnomer. The way we test it is whether a person or an animal can give evidence that they can get into the other person's shoes or the other person's mind and see the world from that person's perspective. Now, the test of it is often not just can you see from the viewpoint of the other person, but could you see that someone has a different viewpoint from your own?
The theory of mind might provide one way of working out if animals other than humans are conscious.
The only species that we're absolutely sure has theory of mind is human. And maybe humans older than roughly 3 years old. It's very controversial whether any other animals have it. They're arguing about whether chimps have theory of mind or not.
Before we can have a theory of mind, we must recognize ourselves. For decades, scientists have used something called the Rouge test to see whether animals do just that. Human babies do from about 18 months old. Chimpanzees, presented with mirrors, soon use them to groom themselves, much as we do. Elephants, dolphins, and magpies also can respond to mirrors in ways that suggest self-recognition.
The problem with the Rouge test that the animal researchers always raise is that maybe it's just body knowledge, that it's not mind knowledge. So it was interpreted as the animal knowing that they have a mind. And theory of mind, as we normally think about it, is related to another person, not to the self. But presumably you have to know that you have a mind before you project that same capability onto someone else.
Identifying the neural correlates of self-recognition in animals.
So what's a neural correlate? Challenger. ¿Ya tenemos Horizon Arcade? No. Ah, sí.
Horizon Arcade will begin soon. Good luck.
Órale, ¿por qué estaba tan oscuro?
Would be a hard task. But if we were able to do it,
Let me try something new.
Hola, encantado de conocerte. Creo que haremos un gran trabajo juntos.
Hey, you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. How about you? Can you hear me all right?
Perfect, yes. Alright, so help me understand, what's a neural correlate?
Sure. A neural correlate refers to the relationship between brain activity and specific cognitive functions or experiences. Essentially, it's about identifying which parts of the brain are active during certain mental tasks or experiences. Does that help?
I'm sorry, can you explain it like if I was a teenager?
Sure. Think of your brain like a big computer. When you do something, like playing a game or feeling happy, specific parts of your brain light up and become active. Those active parts are called the neural correlates. They show which parts of your brain are working during different tasks. Does that make sense?
Okay. Can you use it in an example for my mind to connect the dots between other concepts?
Sure. Let's say you're listening to your favorite song. While you do that, certain areas of your brain that process sound and emotions become active. If you're also remembering the lyrics, parts of your brain involved in memory light up too. These specific brain areas that become active are the neural correlates for listening to music. So, understanding these correlates helps us connect what we do or feel with what's happening in our brain. Does that help connect the dots?
Okay. Yeah, I think so now.
You're welcome.
Charger or Challenger? Wait. Dodge Challenger. Bueno, vamos a intentar con esto, anyway.
comparative studies would be themselves, much as we do. Elephants, dolphins, and magpies also can respond.
You have a red square.
Current on, she lost consciousness. As soon as he switched it off, she regained it.
Bank those skills!
No one knows why we have consciousness. It's one of the big mysteries. Why did evolution bother putting consciousness in? How did evolution put consciousness in? Why couldn't we have done everything that we do with a set of objective mechanisms and no first-person subjective experience of the world? It's one of the biggest questions in philosophy and science.
Just as the processes of consciousness remain a mystery, so does its purpose. Is it a high-level summary the brain generates to help us plan for what comes next? A clever way of designing our brains to make us more adept at being social? Neither? Both? One evolutionary explanation for why we have consciousness suggests that an animal capable of modeling the behavior of another can anticipate it to its advantage.
The surprising thing is that so few animals actually have this ability. We humans have it. So I have a very good idea of what you're going to do and when you're going to do it and why you're going to do it. And children starting at maybe around 3 years old get that.
Janet Metcalf studies something called the theory of mind.
Theory of mind is actually a misnomer. The way we test it is whether a person or an animal can give evidence that they can get into the other person's shoes or the other person's mind and see the world from that person's perspective. Now, the test of it is often not just can you see from the viewpoint of the other person, but could you see that someone has a different viewpoint from your own?
The theory of mind might provide one way of working out if animals other than humans are conscious.
The only species that we're absolutely sure has theory of mind is human. And maybe humans older than roughly 3 years old. It's very controversial whether any other animals have it. They're arguing about whether chimps have theory of mind or not.
Before we can have a theory of mind, we must recognize ourselves. For decades, scientists have used something called the Rouge test to see whether animals do just that. Human babies do from about 18 months old. Chimpanzees, presented with mirrors, soon use them to groom themselves, much as we do. Elephants, dolphins, and magpies also can respond to mirrors in ways that suggest self-recognition.
The problem with the Rouge test that the animal researchers always raise is that maybe it's just body knowledge, that it's not mind knowledge. So it was interpreted as the animal knowing that they have a mind. And theory of mind as we normally think about it is related to another person, not to the self. But presumably you have to know that you have a mind before you project that same capability onto someone else.
Identifying the neural correlates of self-recognition in animals would be a hard task. But if we were able to do it, comparative studies would be possible. That would be hugely valuable. Science is edging closer to understanding what parts of the brain might be involved in generating conscious experience. By some estimates, we may not be far away from an empirically sound theory of consciousness and how it evolved. But could a physical theory ever satisfactorily address what it is that people are feeling when they are conscious? David Chalmers calls consciousness the hard problem, a deft description for something that is hard to explain and hard to solve.
The methods of science right now are great for explaining objective processes and objective functions. So when it comes even to explaining things like the behavior of an organism, you can tell some story about a bit of the brain, a neural process or a computer-like process in the brain that makes us behave a certain way. But the problem of consciousness, what we call the hard problem of consciousness, which is explaining how you get subjective experience from the brain, is not that kind of question. It's not a question about how we behave. It's a question about what it's like, about how it feels from the inside. And it looks like you can explain all those objective mechanisms and objective processes, and you still won't have answered the hard problem, which is why is it that all that functioning is accompanied by consciousness?
The hard problem divides philosophers and scientists alike. Some philosophers argue that consciousness can be explained far more simply.
A lot of puzzles, no mysteries. We're going to understand it from the bottom up and from the top down. I have no doubt about that.
Daniel Dennett argues that consciousness is nothing more than a cognitive illusion that science will, in due course, explain.
Our brain has been designed by evolution and then redesigned by cultural evolution to give us a user-friendly system of things in the world that we deal with. So the user-friendly world that we live in, the manifest image, is a sort of friendly user illusion in the same way that the desktop or the laptop is a user illusion. It simplifies and it distorts in helpful ways for most purposes. If you really want to know what's going on, you have to go backstage. And the same thing is true about the brain and consciousness. Until recently, we didn't have very good tools for doing it. The brain was just off limits as distant galaxies. We're now developing the tools for non-invasively studying the brain, and we're now developing the computational ideas and models so that we can understand how a brain can non-miraculously deal with information and refine it and uncover the semantics of the world outside and inside. So we now have the toolkit, and it's taken this long to develop it. Now we just have to use the tools.
Perhaps. But for the time being, the puzzle of consciousness continues to pose more questions than it does answers. Yet another philosopher, Protagoras of Abdera, proclaimed that man is the measure of all things. Until the problem of consciousness is solved, though, that might better be phrased, the measure of all things but himself.
Round 3 complete! Congratulations!
Amigo! Did you come here to...
Shut up. Okay, we're done. How about a world tour?
To beat my street racers or to show off with those ultimate skill chains? To be fair, they were in awe.
Oops. Skyline. MSFS5. O este. Este.
Consciousness. We've all wondered about the mystery of consciousness, but they're really two separate mysteries, as the famous philosopher David Chalmers has emphasized. First, there's the mystery of how our brain processes information, which David calls the easy problems of consciousness. And even though they're actually very hard, we've made huge progress in recent years in building computers that can play chess, that can process natural language, that can answer quiz show questions, that can drive cars, and so on. But then there's a second mystery of consciousness that David calls the hard problem of consciousness. Why do we have subjective experience? If I'm driving a car, I'm having a subjective experience of colors, sounds, emotions, thoughts. But why? Does a self-driving car have any subjective experience? Does it feel like anything at all to be a self-driving car? Well, raise your hand if you have any sort of background in physics. Ooh, some wolves in sheep's clothes here tonight. Well, I'm a physicist too. And from my physics perspective, a conscious person is simply food, rearranged. So why is one arrangement conscious and not the other? Moreover, from my physics perspective, food is just a bunch of quarks and electrons arranged in a certain way. So why is one arrangement, like your brain, conscious, while another arrangement, like a bunch of carrots, not? This physics perspective goes against the idea that philosophers like to call dualism, that consciousness is explained by adding something beyond physics, some extra ingredient, a life force, elan vital, or a soul. And this idea of dualism has gradually lost popularity among scientists. If you were to measure what all the particles in your brain are doing and find that they perfectly obey the laws of physics, then that would mean that this purported soul is having absolutely no effect on what you're doing. Whereas if you were to measure instead that these particles in your brain are not obeying the laws of physics because they're being pushed around somehow by the soul, then that brings the soul into the domain of physics, right? Because you can now just measure all these new forces that the soul is exerting and study the properties physically of it, just as you would study the properties of a new field or a new particle like the Higgs boson. Now, from my physics perspective, a bunch of moving quarks and electrons are nothing but a mathematical pattern in space-time. A bunch of numbers specifying positions and motions and various properties of these particles like electric charge and other numbers that you can see in this table here. And from this physics perspective, the hard question of consciousness that David Chalmers posed gets transformed into a form I like much better. Because we can now start, instead of starting by asking that hard question of why some arrangements of particles feel conscious, we can start with the hard fact that some arrangement of particles, like your brain, are conscious and not others. And we can ask, what are the special physical properties that these arrangements have to be conscious? Neuroscientists have had a lot of progress recently, including right here, in figuring out what subjective experiences correspond to different neuron firing patterns in the brain, which they call neural correlates of consciousness. So I want to generalize this idea and ask what subjective experiences correspond to different kinds of particle motions, which you might call physical correlates of consciousness. But before that, this whole physics perspective really begs the question of how can something as complicated as consciousness possibly be explained by something as simple as particles? Well, I think it's because consciousness is a phenomenon that has properties above and beyond the properties of its particles. And we physicists call phenomena that have properties above and beyond those of their parts emergent phenomena. Let me explain this with an example that's simpler than consciousness. Wetness. A water droplet is wet, but an ice crystal or a gas cloud is not wet, even though they're made of the exact same kind of water molecules. So it's not the molecules, not the particles that make the difference, it's the pattern into which they are arranged. So it makes no sense whatsoever to argue about whether a single water molecule is wet or not, because the phenomena of wetness only emerges when you take a vast number of water molecules and arrange them in this special pattern that we call liquid. So solids, liquids, and gases are all emergent phenomena in that they have properties above and beyond those of their particles. They have properties that the particles don't have. Now, I think that just like solids, liquids, and gases, consciousness too is an emergent phenomenon. Because if I drift off into sleep and my consciousness goes away, I'm still made out of the exact same particles. The only thing that changed is the pattern into which my particles were arranged. And if I were to freeze to death, then my consciousness would definitely go away. But I would still consist of exactly the same particles. It's just that they were now rearranged in a, for me, rather unfortunate pattern. So we physicists love studying what happens when you take a lot of particles and you put them together in different patterns. And we love to study what properties emerge, and often these properties are numbers that we can just go out and measure, like how viscous something is, how compressible it is, and so on. And we can use these to classify stuff. For example, if some stuff is very viscous, so it's rigid, we call it a solid, otherwise we call it a fluid. If the fluid is really hard to compress, we call it a liquid, otherwise we call it a gas or a plasma, depending on how it conducts electricity. So Could there be some other number like this that quantifies consciousness? Well, that's exactly what the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi thinks. And he's defined such a quantity that he calls integrated information, phi, which is basically a measure of how much different parts of a system know about each other. And he and his colleagues have managed to measure a simplified version of this quantity using EEG after magnetic stimulation. And it's worked really, really well, this consciousness detector of theirs, managing to identify consciousness in patients that are awake or who are dreaming, but not patients who were anesthetized or who were in deep sleep. And they even correctly identified consciousness in 2 patients with locked-in syndrome, paralyzed and totally unable to communicate in any way. So this is potentially very useful for doctors in the future. But I want to generalize this now to non-biological systems as well. For example, we can ask the question of some future super intelligent computer. Is it conscious or not? So to do this, let's look at systems, let's look at states of matter with emergent phenomena that have something to do with information. To store information, it has to have the physical properties that has some states that are just very long-lived. Most solids will do for this, like my wedding ring, for example. If I engrave my wife's name in this metal, this information will still be there years from now. But if I instead engraved it in a puddle of water, the information will be lost within seconds, right? For a more fun example, let's look at computronium, which is a name given to the most general substance that can compute. There's not enough for it to be able to store information, but it also has to be able to process information. The laws of physics have to make the computronium change over time in a sufficiently complicated way that it can implement arbitrary information processing schemes. Let's define perceptronium also as the most general substance that's conscious, that has a subjective experience. And let's ask, what properties does perceptronium have? I think it has to have, first of all, the same properties as computronium, but at least one more property. When I get back to it. But first, we just have to ask ourselves, how can something as physical as a bunch of moving particles possibly feel as non-physical as our consciousness? Well, I think it's because our consciousness is a phenomenon that doesn't only have properties above and beyond those its parts, but also has properties that are rather independent of its parts, independent of its substrate, independent of the stuff that it's made of. We actually have other phenomena in physics that are also substrate independent in this sense. For example, waves. Waves have properties like wavelength and frequency and speed, and we can describe them really, really accurately with equations, even without knowing what kind of substance the waves are waves in. So these waves, they take a life of their own, above and beyond the substrate. For example, a wave can cross a lake, even though the individual water molecules are just going around in tiny little circles. Computation is also rather substrate independent, because Alan Turing famously proved that any computation can be performed by any substance as long as it has a certain minimum set of abilities to compute. So this means that if you were a self-aware computer game character trapped in the game world in some game in the future super intelligent computer, you would have no way of knowing whether you were running on Windows, on Mac OS, or on some other platform, because you would be substrate independent. Now, I think consciousness is the same way. I think consciousness is a physical phenomenon that feels non-physical, because it's just like waves in computations. More specifically, I think that consciousness is the way information feels when it's being processed in certain complex ways. So this means that it's substrate independent, and this also means that it's only the structure of the information processing that matters, not the structure of the matter that's doing the information processing. In other words, we have the laws of physics, right? And they govern these motions of stuff. If the motion obeys certain principles, we can get this emergent phenomena of computation, information processing. But now we can take this idea to another level. We can say, suppose this information processing obeys certain principles, then we can get higher level emergent phenomenon, consciousness. So what will these principles be? We of course don't know what sufficient conditions are for a physical system to be conscious, but let me tell you about 4 necessary conditions that I've explored in my work. I've already argued that consciousness is the way that information feels when it's being processed. So for a physical system to be conscious, then first of all, it has to be able to store information, like a computer, and it has to be able to process information, like a computer. But it also, I think, needs to be relatively independent of the rest of the world, because otherwise this conscious entity would not feel like it had any sort of independent existence at all. And finally, like Giulio Tononi argued, I think that the system has to be relatively integrated into a unified whole. Because otherwise, if we have 2 independent systems, then this is going to feel like 2 separate conscious entities rather than one. Okay, so what do we make of this idea then that consciousness is the way information feels when being processed by particles moving around in certain ways? Is it good news or is it bad news? Well, I think it's good news. And if someone argues that it's bad news because they don't like the idea of being just a bunch of particles, then I object to their use of the word just. Because let's face it, you guys are not just a bunch of particles. Your brain are the most beautifully complex space-time patterns in our entire known universe. And moreover, as I've argued, your consciousness has properties above and beyond those of your particles that are in fact rather independent of your particles. So it's not the particles, but the patterns that really matter. I also think this is good news because it means that in our quest to understand consciousness, we're not stuck waiting for some missing ingredient. So this is really about asking the right question. And instead of asking, we're stuck, so what missing thing can we blame our failure on? Right? Let's instead ask the question, might it be, despite how it all seems, that we already have all the ingredients we need to solve our problem? I think this question is actually a very powerful one, both in science and in our everyday lives. And I hope you'll try it out yourselves. For example, people used to ask, what new undiscovered force prevents the moon from falling down? Nothing, Isaac Newton came along and said. The moon obeys the same laws of physics, he said, as everything else, and this bold idea, of course, revolutionized modern science. Then you can ask, what is it that breathes life into a clump of atoms and makes it alive? Again, scientists have discovered that the answer is nothing. Because the difference between a dead bug and a living bug isn't that you add some sort of secret life sauce to it. It's simply the pattern into which the particles are arranged that matters. Then you can ask, what breathes fire into an information processing system and makes it conscious? Well, I've argued here tonight that again, the answer is nothing. Because what matters is simply the structure of the information processing. And finally, if our entire cosmos turns out to be perfectly described by physical laws, like modern physics suggests, then we can ask Stephen Hawking's famous question, what is it that breathes fire into a mathematical structure and makes a universe for it to describe? Well, I've argued that consciousness is a mathematical pattern, which means that some mathematical patterns simply are conscious, which means that the answer to this question is also nothing. Because the only difference then between a structure that exists only mathematically and one that also exists physically is not the presence of some sort of physical existence, magical angel dust, but simply its structure. So here is the idea that I would like you all to take with me tonight. Instead of asking, what do we need to add to physics to explain consciousness? Consider the idea that maybe we don't need to add anything at all. That because consciousness is simply the way information feels when it's being processed in certain complex ways by particles moving around in very special patterns. And let us instead ask, what are these patterns? What are their physical properties? Because it's the It's not the particles, but the patterns that really matter. Thank you.
The universe is really big. We live in a galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy. There are about 100 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And if you take a camera and you point it at a random part of the sky, just keep the shutter open, as long as your camera is attached to the Hubble Space Telescope, you will see something like this. Every one of these little blobs is a galaxy roughly the size of our Milky Way, 100 billion stars. Each of those blobs, there are approximately 100 billion galaxies in the observable universe. 100 billion is the only number you need to know. The age of the universe, as you now are saying, is 100 billion in dog years, which tells you something about our place in the universe. One thing you can do with a picture like this is simply admire it. It's extremely beautiful. I've often wondered what is the evolutionary factor that made our ancestors develop, adapt, and evolve to really enjoy pictures of galaxies. But we would also like to understand it. As a cosmologist, I want to ask, why is the universe like this? One big clue we have is the universe is changing with time. And look at one of these galaxies and measure its velocity. It will be moving away from you. And if you look at a galaxy even further away, it will be moving away faster. So we say the universe is expanding. What that means, of course, is that in the past, things were closer together. In the past, the universe was more dense, and it was also hotter. It could squeeze things together, the temperature goes up. That kind of makes sense to us. The thing that doesn't make sense to us as much is that the universe at early times, near the Big Bang, was also very, very smooth. You might think that that's not a surprise. The air in this room is very smooth. You might say, well, maybe things just smooth themselves out. But the conditions near the Big Bang are very, very different from the conditions of the air in this room. In particular, things were a lot denser. The gravitational pull of things was a lot stronger near the Big Bang. What you have to think about is, we have a universe with 100 billion galaxies, 100 billion stars each. At early times, those 100 billion galaxies were squeezed into a region about this big, literally, at early times. And you have to imagine doing that squeezing without any imperfections, without any little spots where there were a few more atoms than somewhere else. Because if there had been, they would collapse under the gravitational pull into a huge black hole. Keeping the universe very, very smooth at early times is not easy. It's a delicate arrangement. But the early universe is not chosen randomly. There was something that made it that way, and we'd like to know what. So part of our understanding of this was given to us by Ludwig Boltzmann, an Austrian physicist in the 19th century. And Boltzmann's contribution was that he helped us understand entropy. You've heard of entropy, it's the randomness, the disorder, the chaoticness of some system. Boltzmann gave us a formula engraved on his tombstone now that really quantifies what entropy is. And it's basically just saying that entropy is the number of ways you can rearrange the constituents of the system so that you don't notice. So that macroscopically it looks the same. If you have the air in this room, you don't notice each individual atom. A low entropy configuration is one in which there's only a few arrangements that look that way. A high entropy arrangement means there are many arrangements that look that way. This is a crucially important insight because it helps us explain the second law of thermodynamics. The law that says that entropy increases in the universe or in some isolated bit of the universe. The reason why entropy increases is simply because there are many more ways to be high entropy than to be low entropy. That's a wonderful insight, but it leaves something out. This insight that entropy increases, by the way, is what's behind what we call the arrow of time, the difference between the past and the future. Every difference that there is between the past and the future is because entropy is increasing. The fact that you can remember the past becomes the future. The fact that you are born, and then you live, and then reflection of the fact that the early universe was very, very smooth. We'd like to understand that. That's our job as cosmologists. Unfortunately, it's actually not a problem that we've been giving enough attention to. It's not one of the first things people would say if you asked a modern cosmologist, what are the problems we're trying to address? One of the people who did understand that this was a problem was Richard Feynman. 50 years ago, he gave a series of a bunch of different lectures. You've heard about them already. He gave the popular lectures that became the character of physical law. He gave lectures to Caltech undergrads that became the Feynman lectures on physics. He gave lectures to Caltech graduate students that became the Feynman lectures on gravitation. In every one of these books, every one of these sets of lectures, he emphasized this puzzle. Why did the early universe have such a small entropy? So he says, I'm not going to do the accent. He says, for some reason, the universe at one time had a very low entropy for its energy content, and since then, the entropy has increased. The arrow of time cannot be completely understood until the mystery of the beginnings of the history of the universe are reduced still further from speculation to understanding. So that's our job. We want to know, this is 50 years ago, surely you're thinking, we figured it out by now. It's not true that we figured it out by now. In fact, it's more than a 50-year-old problem. Boltzmann understood that this was a problem, and he suggested an answer to it. Before I get to that, I should say that the reason the problem has gotten worse rather than better is because in 1998, we learned something crucial about the universe that we didn't know before. We learned that it's accelerating. The universe is not only expanding. If you look at that galaxy, it's moving away. If you come back a billion years later and look at it again, it will be moving away faster. Individual galaxies are speeding away from us faster and faster, so we say the universe is accelerating. Unlike the low entropy of the early universe, even though we don't know the answer for this, we at least have a good theory that can explain it if that theory is right, and that's the theory of dark energy. It's just the idea that empty space itself has energy. In every little cubic centimeter of space, whether or not there's stuff, whether or not there's particles, matter, radiation, or whatever, there is still energy even in the space itself. And this energy, according to Einstein, exerts a push on the universe. It is a perpetual impulse that pushes galaxies apart from each other. Because dark energy, unlike matter or radiation, does not dilute away as the universe expands. The amount of energy in each cubic centimeter remains the same even as the universe gets bigger and bigger. This has crucial implications for what the universe is going to do in the future. For one thing, the universe will expand forever. Back when I was your age, we didn't know what the universe was going to do. Some people thought that the universe would recollapse in the future. Einstein was fond of this idea. But if there's dark energy and the dark energy does not go away, the universe is just going to keep expanding forever and ever and ever. 14 billion years has passed, $100 billion has passed, but an infinite number of years into the future. Meanwhile, for all intents and purposes, space looks finite to us. Space may be finite or infinite, but because the universe is accelerating, there are parts of it we cannot see and never will see. There's a finite region of space that we have access to surrounded by a horizon, so even though time goes on forever, space is limited to us. Finally, empty space has a temperature. In the 1970s, Stephen Hawking told us that a black hole, even though you think it's black, it actually emits radiation when you take into account quantum mechanics. The curvature of space-time around the black hole brings to life quantum mechanical fluctuations, and the black hole radiates. A precisely similar calculation by Hawking and Gary Gibbons showed that if you have dark energy in empty space, then the whole universe radiates. The energy of empty space brings to life quantum fluctuations, and so even though the universe will last forever, and ordinary matter and radiation will dilute away, there will always be some radiation, some thermal fluctuations, even in empty space. So what this means is that the universe is like a box of gas that lasts forever. Well, what is the implication of that? That implication was studied by Boltzmann back in the 19th century. He said, well, entropy increases because there are many, many more ways for the universe to be high entropy rather than low entropy. But that's a probabilistic statement. It will probably increase, and the probability is enormously huge. It's not something you have to worry about, the air in this room all gathering over one part of the room and suffocating us. It's very, very unlikely. Except, if they locked the doors and kept us here literally forever, that would happen. Everything that is allowed, every configuration that is allowed to be attained by the molecules in this room would eventually be obtained. So Boltzmann says, look, you could start with a universe that was in thermal equilibrium. He didn't know about the Big Bang, he didn't know about the expansion of the universe. He thought that space and time were explained by Isaac Newton. They were absolute, they just stuck there forever. So his idea of a natural universe was one in which the air molecules were just spread out evenly everywhere, the everything molecules. But if you're a Boltzmann, you know that if you wait long enough, the random fluctuations of those molecules will occasionally bring them into lower energy, lower entropy configurations. And then, of course, in the natural course of things, they will expand back. So it's not that entropy must always increase. You can get fluctuations into lower entropy, more organized situations. Well, if that's true, Boltzmann then goes on to invent two very modern-sounding ideas, the multiverse and the anthropic principle. He says, the problem with thermal equilibrium is that we can't live there. Remember, life itself depends on the arrow of time. We would not be able to process information, metabolize, walk, and talk if we lived in thermal equilibrium. So if you imagine a very, very big universe, an infinitely big universe, with randomly bumping into each other particles, there will occasionally be small fluctuations in the lower entropy states, and then they relax back. But there will also be large fluctuations. Occasionally you will make a planet, or a star, or a galaxy, or 100 billion galaxies. So Boltzmann says, we will only live in the part of the multiverse, in the part of this infinitely big set of fluctuating particles, where life is possible. That's the regions where entropy is low. Maybe our universe is just one of those things that happens from time to time. Now, your homework assignment is to really think about this, to contemplate what it means. Carl Sagan once famously said that in order to make an apple pie, you must first invent the universe. But he was not right. In Boltzmann's scenario, if you want to make an apple pie, you just wait for the random motion of atoms to make you an apple pie. That will happen much more frequently than the random motions of atoms making you an apple orchard and some sugar and an oven and then making you an apple pie. So this scenario makes predictions. And the predictions are that the fluctuations that make us are minimal. Even if you imagine that this room we are in now exists and is real, and here we are, and we have not only our memories, but our impressions that outside there's something called Caltech in the United States and the Milky Way galaxy. It's much easier for all those impressions to randomly fluctuate into your brain than for them actually to randomly fluctuate into Caltech, the United States, and the galaxy. The good news is that, therefore, this scenario does not work. It is not right. This scenario predicts that we should be a minimal fluctuation. Even if you get our galaxy out, you would not get 100 billion other galaxies. And Feynman also understood this. Feynman says, from the hypothesis that the world is a fluctuation, all the predictions are that if we look at a part of the world we've never seen before, we will find it mixed up, not like the piece we just looked at, high entropy. If our order were due to a fluctuation, we would not expect order anywhere but where we've just noticed it. We therefore conclude the universe is not a fluctuation. So that's good. The question is then, what is the right answer? If the universe is not a fluctuation, why did the early universe have a low entropy? And I would love to tell you the answer, but I'm running out of time. Here is the universe that we tell you about versus the universe that really exists. This is I just showed you this picture. The universe is expanding for the last 10 billion years or so. It's cooling off. But we now know enough about the future of the universe to say a lot more. If the dark energy remains around, the stars around us will use up their nuclear fuel, they will stop burning, they will fall into black holes. We will live in a universe with nothing in it but black holes. That universe will last 10 to the 100 years. A lot longer than our little universe has been. The future is much longer than the past. But even black holes don't last forever. They will evaporate, and we will be left with nothing but empty space. That empty space lasts essentially forever. However, you notice that since empty space gives off radiation, there's actually thermal fluctuations, and it cycles around all the different possible combinations of the degrees of freedom that exist in empty space. So even though the universe lasts forever, there's only a finite number of things that can possibly happen in the universe. They all happen over a period of time equal to 10 to the 10 to the 120 years. So here's two questions for you. Number one, if the universe lasts for 10 to the 10 to the 120 years, why are we born in the first 14 billion years of it, in the warm, comfortable afterglow of the Big Bang? Why aren't we in empty space? You might say, well, there's nothing there to be living, but that's not right. You could be a random fluctuation out of the nothingness. Why aren't you? More homework assignments. So like I said, I don't actually know the answer. I'm going to give you my favorite scenario. Either it's just like that, there is no explanation, this is a brute fact about the universe that you should learn to accept and stop asking questions. Or maybe the Big Bang is not the beginning of the universe. An egg, an unbroken egg, is a low entropy configuration, and yet when we open our refrigerator, we do not go, ha, how surprising to find this low entropy configuration in our refrigerator. That's because an egg is not a closed system, it comes out of a chicken. Maybe the universe comes out of a universal chicken. Maybe there is something that naturally, through the growth of the laws of physics, gives rise to a universe like ours in low entropy configuration. If that's true, it will happen more than once. You will be part of a much bigger multiverse. That's my favorite scenario. So the organizers asked me to end with a bold speculation. My bold speculation is that I will be absolutely vindicated by history. And 50 years from now, all of my current wild ideas will be accepted as truths by the scientific and external communities. We will all believe that our little universe is just a small part of a much larger multiverse. And even better, we will understand what happened at the Big Bang in terms of a theory that we'll be able to compare to observations. This is a prediction. I might be wrong, but we've been thinking as a human race about what the universe was like, why it came to be in the way it did for many, many years. It's exciting to think we may finally know the answer from it. Thank you.
Hi, hello. Well, I'm going to be talking about the work of about 1,000 people who sit on the shoulders of a lot of other people. And so this is, don't think of me as the sole proprietor of this thing. Let me start by showing you the man who started it all. That gentleman is Isaac Newton. And many of you know about him because of the equation he has down the bottom there. I'm not asking that you solve that equation. But I am asking you to listen to me a little about it. It's a very good equation. It says the force of two objects that are affected by gravity is proportional to some constant, big G. Let's not worry about that. But most important part is it's proportional to the mass of one object and the mass of the other. That's what's in the numerator. And it gets weaker and weaker as the square of the distance. And that law, by the way, is the thing that Newton discovered, worked on the ground for something that dropped on the ground, but it also worked spectacularly well for things in the heavens. And that association makes Newton a famous man, to make that association in the first place. But it turns out it's a flawed relationship. And where it's wrong is when you begin to think about how quickly information travels in the gravitational field, or if things move very, very fast. It's not so flawed that you can't get people to the moon with that equation. But if you want to do something more subtle, like make your GPS work on your cell phone, you got to do better than that equation. So you come along, and here's Albert Einstein with a completely different equation. I'm not going to ask you to solve that equation. I can barely solve it myself. In fact, I can't. Let's be honest about it. But the thing is that it says something different, which is very different. There's no force anymore. That big G that's on the left is the geometry of space and time. And somehow, the 8 pi we all understand, but the next thing, that big T, is related to the mass and energy that is in that space. And that is not, there's no more gravitational force. It's a brand new idea. And that incorporates some new ideas, which I'll show you as best as I can in this picture. I don't know how many of you know what a jungle gym looks like, but I'm assuming you do. If you come from New York, you definitely know what a jungle gym is. And what has been done here is a cut has been taken through the jungle gym, And that's all those little squares you're seeing. And if you look at that, they were all squares that were nice and square to begin with. This is a two-dimensional cut through the gym. And on top of that, what you don't see, because I didn't draw it in there, are every little intersection of those lines has a little clock on it. And if you had the clocks there, you would notice that all the clocks kept the same time where around you, where the things haven't yet gotten curvy looking. But those things, when you get near the curvy things, which are in this case induced by the sun, that big yellow thing, and then there's a little dimple that's made in it by the Earth, which is over to the right. I hope you can see that. And those dimples, that distortion of space and the distortion of time, is the way Einstein would describe gravity. And then what happens is those distortions tell matter how to move around in the space. It's a completely different view of the way you think about gravity, and it incorporates this idea which was essential to what we discovered, and that's gravitational waves. And what are gravitational waves? I'll try to show you what they are. They are things that are generated by masses that accelerate, not things that move at constant speed, but things that are getting faster with time. The velocity changes with time. That's the kind of thing that makes gravitational waves. The other thing that they have properties of is that they believe, and Einstein believed, they would move at the propagation speed of light. The speed of light. That was the hope. And now I want to show you they're transverse waves. What does that mean? I'll try to show you that now. They're like the waves you have in your bathtub, or you see on the surface of a lake. And let me start this by, those dots are little masses that have been spread all over space. You're at that place in the middle where there's a little red square. I don't know if you can see it. I can see it in my monitor here. And you'll notice two properties of that particular thing. All those dots measure what's happening to space. The time is also being changed, but we're not going to talk about that for a moment. And so what happens here is you'll notice an interesting thing. You play the dots, there's some dots that are coming together, and some that are spreading apart, and that keeps flipping. So you notice in the up and down direction and in the sideways direction, they're always opposite motions. Expansion in one, contraction in the other. Can you see that, I hope? Good. The other property is that the further the dots are away from the little red dot in the middle, the more they wiggle, the more they move. The dots right close to the red spot, they don't move much. The ones that are far apart, they move a lot. And that's all you need to know about gravitational waves to understand how you might detect them. We'll learn a little bit more about how they get accelerated and where that acceleration comes from at the end, and how we now have seen systems that make these waves. But let me show you how you detect the waves. And this is a little mock-up. Think of a gravitational wave like the one you just saw coming down on that picture, okay? And that little round thing is a laser. It makes laser light. The thing that's the next thing over, I wish I could point, but is a beam splitter which splits the light. You'll see that in a minute. And then your dots that, if you want to imagine in the picture I just showed you, imagine that red square around that thing called the beam splitter, which is that thing in the middle. And then the dots are those two mirrors that are way at the ends. And then there's a detector. Let's start the thing. And you'll see why it'll get a little clearer to you. Here's the laser making light. Wherever there's red, there's light. And the wiggly thing in the light is the electromagnetic wave that is making the light. We have to watch that. It hits the mirror, comes back, and it comes back to the beam splitter. The beam splitter is like a halfway mirror. And now both sides have spent equal amounts of time for the light, and they go to the detector on the right, and there's no light at the detector. You can see the lights cancel. Why? Because of the wave nature of light. Now comes the gravitational wave down. It comes down on this thing. It stretches one arm, and then stretches the other arm, and it makes light come at the detector, because the time it takes light to go the two paths is no longer exactly equal. That's the basis of the whole concept of how these gravitational waves were detected. Now the trouble, as you'll see in a minute, is this one. That guy on the left is Kip Thorne, who is another one of the Nobel Prize winners, also very famous for making a movie called Interstellar. How many of you have seen that? A lot of you, okay. And there he is doing something crazy with a laser. It's not my favorite picture of him, but in that are some equations which I'll just describe to you. That thing we were just talking about in the gravitational wave, I call it H. It's that symbol H. It's the change in length. It's that motion that you saw of the dots divided by their separation. And that is a constant in that picture. It changes sign, but it's always the same. Things that are very close together, they don't move much. Things that are very far apart, they move a lot. That's what that expression says. And what you saw was a huge amount of motion. What Kip told us very early was that if you're going to try to measure a gravitational wave, the best you're going to ever see, if you're going to have a hope for seeing it, you have to measure a strain of 10 to the minus 21. What is that? That's a decimal point with 20 zeros, 0.00000, keep on going, and then there's a 1. It's a tiny, tiny number. And that tiny number can be expressed in other ways. How well with the light do you have to measure the motion of those masses? Well, 1 part in a million times smaller than the wavelength of light itself. That's what those bottom 2 equations say. And you and I, all in this room, are shaking around ourselves by about a millionth of the wavelength of light. So you have to get rid of a lot of problems first before you can do this. And that took about 40 years. So how then was, this is the next development in this thing, was these detectors were placed all over the world. And the ones that made the detection first, and the one you're going to see some results from, are the ones in the United States. There's one in Hanford, that's in Washington State, another one in Louisiana. But there are other detectors. There's one in Italy, in Virgo. It's another detector, the same kind. There's one that's almost ready to run, Carreer, which is in Japan, and then there's one being built in India. And that's a whole network, and you'll see in a minute why it's important to have a network. Now, a quick look of what things look like. This is LIGO looking down. You're looking down on LIGO in Louisiana here. And, oh no, I shouldn't have done that. Oh yes, I should have. Okay, it's now going to run. Okay, good. That was LIGO in Louisiana. That's LIGO in Washington State. This is a big concrete cover over the vacuum system in both Louisiana and in Hanford. Here's what the vacuum system is. There's a very good vacuum in there. The laser beams go back and forth in that. Here's a table which people work on to make the apparatus work. It looks just like a lab here at MIT or at Harvard.